Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is my actual second time around, and last year was funny because for those of you who are from states that have real snow, last year there was snow on the day that I spoke, and so of course schools were closed down and things like that. But more importantly, Congress was shut down as well. So C-SPAN came to our talk. And so I was filmed on that one, and it was really funny because the next day you get emails from students you haven't heard from in 20, 30 years saying, I saw you on C-SPAN, and I write back, what are you doing watching C-SPAN at midnight? They're political junkies, so I assume some of you are also political junkies, and I applaud you for taking the 2 weeks away from your typical schedule to come to Washington, D.C. I firmly believe that there's really nothing like it. You can't go to Epcot and see Washington, D.C. and say, oh, I understand how politics works. But I think if you're living in D.C., even if it's 2 weeks, you get a glimpse, I think, for what it's really like. And it's nothing like you can learn from textbooks and things like that. I worked at USF, and I also worked for the University of Pennsylvania, and in both capacities, I preached the importance of coming to D.C. to do internships. And when I worked for Penn, I actually ran their D.C. program. So the students would come down from Philadelphia but many times they were international students and things like that. And that semester was just transformative for many of them in terms of narrowing their career options, opening up new opportunities or interests that they didn't know they had. So anyway, congratulations and kudos for taking part in this program. So I'm here today to talk about White House staff turnover. And to me, the fun part about it is that I've been studying White House staff turnover since the late 90s. I wrote my dissertation on what happens when presidents run for re-election. And my question was, how do presidents simultaneously run the government and run a re-election campaign? Because if you look at Elizabeth Warren, if you look at Bernie Sanders, if you look at Joe Biden, it seems like running the campaign is all-consuming. So then the question for me was, how do they do this in a sort of, how do they structure their re-election campaign? How do they tend to the business of campaigning and governing? And so I looked at re-election campaigns from Eisenhower through Clinton. And what I realized, one of the things that then ties into my interest in White House staff turnover, is I realized that a lot of senior advisors left at year 3. And that was right after the midterm elections. And that was because they shifted over to what would become the re-election campaign. And so I realized that there was this staff exodus, and that led me to the next question, which was, what do we know about White House staff turnover? How long do these senior advisors stay in their job? For those of you who have studied business or pay attention to CNBC and Forbes and those kinds of magazines, you know that whenever there's a departure in the private sector, a CEO, a CFO, it's a huge deal. Many times the stock price might drop, there's all kinds of speculation on the next leader and what will happen to the company at that point, etc. So anyway, that's kind of the birth, and that's the point at which I kind of became interested in White House staff turnover. So I published something, I think, in 2002, and then again in 2009, and then again in 2013, and there was very little interest in White House staff turnover. But I asked the question, when you're a graduate student too, you have advisors that try to help shape your kind of ability to conduct further research. And one of the questions they always ask is, so what? Why do we care? Why should we care about White House staff turnover? Well, just a little side here. I never do PowerPoints. So this is my first one I've ever done. It has no frills, no colors, no nothing. But part of it is, in the past, I was very old school and stuck to it because I thought that PowerPoints were sometimes distracting, and people felt like they had to write everything down, and it distracted them from the talk. So that's why I steered away from it. But I figured with a larger audience and with some key points, it might be okay to have a PowerPoint. But if you're wondering why it's so basic, it's because my skills are very preschool oriented at this point on PowerPoint. So anyway, why do we care about White House staff turnover? Why is it important to even study this topic? The first answer is these staffers are amongst the most influential, unelected individuals in our government. They have ready access to the president. They inform his, or maybe her at some point, opinion on all kinds of issues, domestic, foreign, economic policy, critical decision-making. And you know probably just from basic, being a citizen that getting access to the president to talk about your issue, let's say you work for an advocacy organization or you have a particular issue you care about, it's very difficult to get access to even presidential staff, let alone the president. So these individuals have ready access to the president, and they're incredibly influential. And also, as I mentioned before, we care deeply about turnover at the highest levels in the private sector, so why shouldn't we care about turnover at the government level, the most senior staff level? And finally, there's important consequences to high turnover. As you might imagine, turnover is very inefficient. If you have to keep hiring and rehiring, you waste a lot of time in the recruiting process, in the training process, not to mention the fact that in Washington, D.C., the coin of the realm is relationships. And working in the White House, you really can't do anything. It's not the Congress, it's not the legislative branch, it's not the judicial branch. So really, you're there to foster relations with people in the executive branch, with advocacy organizations, with the press, with Capitol Hill staffers, with members of Congress, etc. So when you depart, you can't just give your relationships to your successor. They're gone. And the new person that comes in has to reestablish all of these new relationships in order to advance the president's agenda and the president's goals. So there are consequences. It's inefficient. You can't replicate it. Another point I would make is I often am involved in oral histories at the Miller Center and at the University of Virginia, where they interview former staff. And I believe from one of those interviews, an individual told me that it took him about 18 months to learn his job in the White House. So you have to remember that these jobs, there is no prior training unless you've been in a prior White House. And so you get into the White House and you're trying to figure out what to do. You're establishing and building these relationships. And he said it took him about 18 months to learn, to really get it down, what he needed to do and how to do it. And then by month 24, he was just burned out. The hours are incredibly long, probably 70 to 80 work hours a week. The pressure, as you might imagine, is ridiculously high. And it's just a very tense environment. And unlike other jobs, you only have 4 years. You might have 8 years, but you know for sure going in after Inauguration Day that you have 4 years. So you're running up against the clock as well. So there are all kinds of unique pressures in White House jobs that there aren't in other types of jobs. So having established that this is a worthwhile topic, we should care about these individuals, the next topic is the $64,000 question of how do you define presidential staff? You might be surprised to know that there is actually no formal, comprehensive, current list of senior employees for the White House. I have a problem with this. I think there should be full public access to this, but there's not. And so there are things like the U.S. Government Manual, which is a GPO, Government Publishing Organization publication. But if you look at it, I looked at it in the year 2017, looking at who the Trump administration had posted in these jobs. They had people from the Obama administration that were still in some of these jobs, which they weren't. And so that's an unreliable document. The president has to issue a report to Congress every June, and it includes the names of the people that work for the president as well as their salaries. So you could say, well, that's something I could use, but it also includes a fair number of people who work in the White House as civil servants. There's lots of people who record formal documents, do a lot of the curating of the documents, computer staff. There's just people who are not political who work in the White House. And this particular report to Congress includes everybody, including the ushers in the White House. So that's not very useful. And also, I have found mistakes on it, and I have found that it's not exactly current as well. So it's very difficult to get your hands on some sort of list to determine turnover. But what happened in the year 1981 is there's a publication that no longer exists in the form it did. It was called the National Journal, and it was a weekly publication, and it was kind of like Inside Baseball. If you cared a lot about politics in DC, you would want to read this magazine. So it was, when magazines were a big deal, the National Journal was well known along with something called CQ, or Congressional Quarterly. And what they did in 1981 is they assigned like 5 to 6 reporters and said, this is January after Ronald Reagan is elected. And they said, we want you to scour the city, talk to all the people that you know from the White House in the Reagan days when he was governor, and find out who the most influential staff members are. And the publication was called Decision Makers, and it was released in April of 1981. And since then, they did it in April 1981. And the idea was they wanted to come up with a document that showed the most influential staff members on President Reagan's staff And in addition to that, it included biographies. So where they had worked before, what level of education they have, their age, things like that. And so they did that, and then they kept doing it through Obama in 2009. So this is a treasure trove for a political scientist. Because as a social scientist, I could never assign influence. How could I ever determine who the most influential people were in the White House staff? That's sort of beyond my means, right? But the National Journal did it for me. They had this team of reporters who went out and, through their own reporting and their own research, determined who they thought were the most influential staff members. So they published this Decision Makers special edition up through Obama, and then Trump came along, a reporter. So I had published various articles. I had basically what you do is you get all the names, you do a lot of research to try to figure out when they started in the White House, when they left. And so from there, you could get a sense of what the average tenure was. And it was about 30 months. So on average, these staffers, these A-team staffers, I call them, stayed about 30 months in office. And along comes President Trump, and a resourceful young reporter called me and said, so now what are you gonna do? You know, are you gonna keep being able to do your study about turnover? What's gonna happen? And I said, well, the National Journal doesn't exist anymore. I'm not really sure what to do. And she's like, I have an idea. Why don't we team up? And we basically teamed up, and we took all the titles that the National Journal had deemed to be A-teamers. And we basically made that list and then inserted Trump people into the positions that were previously deemed A-team staffers. And we thought that would be the most objective way to show the A-team in the Trump administration without the lovely gift of the National Journal and their reporters. So that's what I did to create the data set. So it's a completely objective data set. And on the next slide here, this is how you can see the turnover rates. So you can see I have Reagan, N equals 60, Bush, N equals 57. That means there were 60 decision makers that were named in 1981. In 1989, there were 57, and so on. And so with Trump, we had 65. Okay, so that's kind of the pool that I start with, and that's how I monitor turnover. Once you fall out of the sample, you fall out of the sample, and that's it. So you can see in year one, typically, there's very little turnover. In fact, the average before Trump was 10% in that first year. With President Trump, there was 35% turnover. And that was the point at which my turnover research became interesting to people. And like I said, nobody cares really. A colleague wrote me and said, no one really cares about your research until there's an outlier and it makes it interesting. So I had my outlier in a big way. Because the 35% is just simply, I mean, you can see it, it's off the charts. It's more than triple what happened to Obama, more than double than the closest, which is Ronald Reagan, with 17%. And so what's interesting is you can kind of understand why no one really cared about the research before, because if you don't look at the Trump highlighted column, you know, the trends are pretty similar. Like, not much turnover in year one, you know, a little bit of turnover in year two, a little higher in year three, and then of course in year four, people are kind of fading off a little bit. But the trends were very similar, and that's why nobody cared. They're like, well, this is very, you know, this is not that interesting because the past 4 or 5 presidents have all been pretty similar in their rates of turnover. President Trump comes along, 35% in year one, 31% in year two. Now, it obviously has to come down, right? Because there's only a finite set of people, and once they fall out of the sample, they fall out of the sample. I think the important, noteworthy column here is the total. As of October, his turnover amongst his most senior staff in the White House was 80%, which exceeds his 5 predecessors after an entire 4 years in office. So you can see the next closest would have been Ronald Reagan at 78%, but that was after 4 full years. So this is truly unique. And what's interesting is that, so in January of 18, I published this report about the turnover, and it generated so much interest that now Brookings, we have what we call the turnover tracker. It's a website. It was the second most read page in the year of 2018. And since then, I've had to create something called a serial tracker, because this has never happened in prior administrations, but not only is the turnover high, but in some positions, the turnover has really gotten off the charts. So for instance, The White House now is on their 6th Deputy National Security Advisor, their 6th Communications Director, their 3rd Press Secretary. There's never been that kind of what I call serial turnover. And so remember I told you about the positions that we identified from all of the prior national journals, and then we found the Trump people that fit into those descriptions. Of those 65 positions, over 1/3 have had serial turnover, which means that at least 2 people have been in those jobs. I've never had to create that chart. It never happened before. It was impossible for me to have a chart like that. There may have been like 1 or 2 positions, but never exceeding 20 positions where they've had more than 2 individuals. So let me move you on to the next slide, which is just thinking broadly about turnover in the Trump administration. Once there was so much interest in White House staff turnover, I then turned my focus to monitoring cabinet turnover. So I looked at the 15 cabinet secretaries that are in the line of presidential succession. And what you find with that is there's also record-setting turnover. I didn't include the data here because it's somewhat tangential to what I'm talking about today. But if you go to the White House tracker, we also have a cabinet tracker. And that shows that the turnover rate is also off the charts record-setting. So it's not just that the White House staff turnover is record-setting in the cabinet as well. Cabinet secretaries have come and gone. You might remember the names of Rex Tillerson, Rick Perry, who else is there? There's a lot of them. But the turnover in the cabinet has been high. You might have also heard about the frequency of acting officials in the executive branch of the government. And that's another place where there are many jobs in the executive branch that need Senate confirmation. And if they don't have Senate confirmation, if they don't go through the formal nominating process, the president appoints someone to be the acting official. You might remember there was an acting attorney general for a while. So, and that's another case. It's difficult to get data going back on the frequency of actings, so it's hard to compare chronologically. But I think I can say with pretty much authority that we've never had this many actings in certain positions in the government. The Department of Homeland Security has an enormous number of actings. The Department of Defense has a huge number of actings. The State Department has a huge number of actings. Those are the ones that stand out. But it basically means that the White House Office of Personnel has not put up a nominee to the Senate, and then the Senate has not then proceeded with the confirmation process and a vote to get these individuals into the various positions. So it's not just the Attorney General that Senate's confirmed, it's going to be the Deputy Attorney General, a couple of the deputies, etc. Within each agency, if you think about each agency as a pyramid, at the very top, those officials need to have Senate confirmation. And that's where there is right now an enormous number of vacancies. If you're interested in this topic, I would draw your attention to the Partnership for Public Service, which monitors the frequency. How many positions are still open? How many have been open since day one, January, I think, 20th, 2017? How many are currently open now? And you can really get a sense for the number of vacancies and kind of a government that's incredibly understaffed at the moment. And then if you just think broadly about the things I've never seen before, I've studied this for a really long time. The notion that we're on our 4th National Security Advisor is just unheard of. If I go back in my sample, I can find that Ronald Reagan had 2 National Security Advisors during his first term. Richard V. Allen resigned in that first year. But generally speaking, if I look at the other administrations, the National Security Advisors stayed all 4 years. And you have to think about these jobs. These are great jobs. And oftentimes when the president selects you, you sort of are making a tacit agreement that unless there's some unusual circumstance, you will stay in that job for 4 years. Presidents want stability. They want continuity. So unless you slip up, that job is yours for 4 years. And generally speaking, people would say that the best kind of staff member to have is one that stays as long as possible unless there is a problem. I talked about the importance of relationships and how if you leave, if you depart, you basically left that next individual to figure out all of these new relationships and to forge those relationships and build them and nurture them. So 4 National Security Advisors, 3 Chiefs of Staff. That's, again, the Chief of Staff is a critical position. They're basically kind of the conductor of the orchestra for you, and having to change over and over again is problematic. So everybody wants to know why. Like, why is there so much turnover? And with any question, as with any question, there's never one single answer. I wish it could be simple and you could say, because the reason there's so much turnover is X. It's not that simple. But I would sort of posit a few ideas about why this administration is so unique in terms of staff turnover. First, I would say that he has a very unconventional leadership style. He fires people far more often than others, and that's another thing I study. I've looked at all of these cases. There's about 400 that I have, and there are very few cases of people being fired publicly in the White House staff. And I think that's generally speaking that White Houses like to kind of keep their dirty laundry within the family, right? And so if someone's going to leave, if someone's not performing as well as they should, basically the chief of staff would go tell that individual, listen, we'd like you to kind of move on. Let us know, when do you think that would be most feasible? We'll have a successor in line. And so you as a public or a reporter never gets onto the story that this person was a low performer and had to leave. Usually what you read about in the paper is that, the new deputy chief of staff is, Kevin Walsh. End of story. Like, it's not even a story because other presidents didn't highlight or showcase these staff departures. But President Trump has a management style where he likes to call people out, often on Twitter. And that is just truly unique. And so I think his unconventional management approach to running the government is one of the main reasons for this high-level turnover. I'd also point out to the fact that there was an unconventional campaign. His presidential campaign was very small. If you look at the size of his campaign to Hillary Clinton's, it was much, much smaller. It was composed of a lot of people from the private sector who had no prior government experience. And then there was also the issue where President Trump identified some people, never Trumpers, as basically being prohibited from being appointed to any government job under his administration. And so from the start, most presidents get a lot of their White House staff from people who worked on the campaign. And I shouldn't say that these people who worked on the campaign also worked on that particular candidate's Senate staff or House staff or gubernatorial staff. So it's not like they just worked on the campaign and they only knew them through that period. But oftentimes they do draw heavily from the campaign staff. But if your campaign staff is small, if you have no prior political experience, you just have an unconventional recruiting pool and a small recruiting pool at that. And third, I would say that part of the problem is that turnover begets more turnover. I think that what's happened in the Trump administration is that early on, there was sort of the public humiliation of individual staff members, people leaving their jobs looking much worse than when they walked in the door. The Mueller investigation raised the specter of having to hire your own personal attorney, possibly, appearing before a grand jury. A lot of people probably don't want the anxiety that comes along with serving in an administration where the chief executive fires people frequently and publicly. On the one hand, it's great to have on your resume that you were the chief of staff, but if you've been humiliated in front of the whole country, actually the whole world, maybe that wasn't so great. Maybe that wasn't such a good career choice. And so I think that has perhaps exacerbated the trend of turnover. And people aren't staying. Like I said before, in the 5 prior administrations, the average turnover was about 30 months. I mean, there are some people who have stayed and will stay, stayed longer than that, but it's definitely the exception rather than the rule. So anyway, I'm still studying this. I'm still trying to figure out what's unique about this administration that might help explain why there's so much staff turnover. But I think it's an important topic, and I think as citizens of the United States, you should be concerned. I don't know if you saw recently, but Michael Bloomberg, in one of his campaign speeches, made a big point of saying that management matters and that staff stability matters, and you should care about this. And the reporter who wrote the story about it made an aside about how, that's not really the best slogan. Like, I can manage. I can manage the presidency, I can manage the White House staff. I'll have a more stable staff. It doesn't really kind of go over. Is the economy stupid was sort of a little bit catchier, but. So occasionally people, candidates, and opinion makers get onto the issue of the fact that stability matters, that staff matters, that continuity matters, but by and large I think it gets basically shoved under the rug and people just move on to the next news story. So having sort of gone through my incredible PowerPoint presentation at this point, I'd love to open it up for any questions you have. I always think it's better to kind of get your perspective and what you're interested in, and so I'm happy to try to answer those questions.
Got about 15 minutes for questions, so let's start. Nick?
Hi there. Good morning, Dr. Kemper. Thanks for coming and talking to us. My name is Nick Cropper. I'm from the University of South Florida. Go Bulls. And my question for you is that the Senate is unlikely to reject President Trump's nominations for an unprecedented number of open positions in cabinet secretaries and just throughout the government. This is an opportunity for Senate Republicans to show unity, to show that they're doing something, for Trump to declare minor victories. Why don't we see the Trump administration nominating more people to these open positions, and why don't we see Senate Republicans taking these nominations up?
Yeah, okay, so great question. On the one hand, I give them credit for the judicial nominations. If you notice, it seems like their focus has been myopic on filling all of those judgeships. So on one side of the ledger, I think they would point to that. I don't know why there's so many vacancies and why they don't try to get people through more quickly or get people through at all, but I have a theory, and that is that I think recruitment has been really difficult. I talked to you a little bit about how when there's so much public humiliation of individual staffers at the most senior level, think about Rod Rosenstein as Deputy Attorney General, Rex Tillerson, Jim Mattis. I mean, people that were unimpeachable are having their reputations tarnished. So I think there are a lot of Republicans who might be willing and would certainly the competition for these jobs is less than it normally is. So like, wow, this is a great chance for me to get X or Y job. But I think people are really nervous about joining the administration, and that has led to a smaller recruiting pool. There's also the case that President Trump has had more withdrawn nominations than any other president. And that's because he sometimes sends up people who are unqualified. And so the Senate committees, even the Republicans, are like, we can't put this person forward. And then they leak something to the press, then there's a story in the press, and then the person tends to withdraw from the position. And then the third reason is that, as I mentioned before, he had an unconventional campaign that was smaller. So there are fewer people to start with to fill these jobs. And I have a fourth reason too that just popped into my head. And that is, if you've noticed, sometimes when there is a vacancy and somebody leaves, he pulls somebody from a different job. So for instance, the State Department, he pulls Mike Pompeo from CIA and puts him over at State. Well, then he's got to fill CIO. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. He picks people from different parts of the government. You still have to fill those positions. They've done a lot of that as well. But I agree with your point. You have a majority in the Senate. Why not get all these nominees through? And why not fill the government with people who are going to steer the ship of state in the direction that you want it to go? I have been baffled by that. President Trump talks about how actings give him more flexibility. I'm like, flexibility? Like, don't you want to get your agenda through Congress? You need people who are Senate confirmed. If there's just an acting, it's really difficult for the office to have any sense of long-term planning. The people that work for you are like, when are you leaving? Like, how long are you going to be here? I'm not really sure I want to give my level best to you because you could be gone in a week or two. So actings create so much uncertainty. Sometimes they don't have all the powers that a Senate confirmed individual would have, so their powers are limited. It really is not the best way or the smartest approach or strategy to kind of advance your agenda. So some of it is baffling to me, but I think I've made some attempt to kind of explain a little bit why this president is different in that respect. So thanks for your question. Yeah. Do I go back over here? Yeah. Tennis, okay.
Hi, thank you. My name is Drew Cole. I'm from Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire.
Live free or die.
Yeah, yes. So on the chance that Trump gets reelected in 2020, do you think that he'll try to learn from his first term and try to reduce the number of turnovers and multi-hat approaches within his staff, or do you think that his tactics will remain the same because he clearly values loyalty over experience when it comes to hiring his staff?
Yeah. My general kind of approach to questions about whether someone will change is just generally no, people don't change. They are who they are, and changing from first term to second term, he doesn't even have to move out of the White House. It basically goes from, November 6th, whatever day the election is, to November 7th, he's in the same place. He'll give an inaugural speech, but things won't really be that different. And I think the point about loyalty and wanting people he knows around him. That's why he plucks people from different jobs. It's like he's seen them with one job and he thinks, oh, they might be good for this, and I know them and I trust them. So because of those reasons, and because just generally speaking, I think people's personalities don't really change on a dime, and it's really hard to change some of those characteristics and qualities, I don't anticipate. I think there'll still be a lot of vacancies, there'll still be a lot of people he gives multiple jobs to. I mean, look at the portfolio of Jared Kushner. No offense, I mean, despite the fact that he's the son-in-law, his portfolio is the broadest portfolio I think I've ever seen in presidential staff history. And, you know, he's going from staff infrastructure to negotiating peace in the Middle East, which is really easy to do. And, yeah, and then there was the criminal reform bill that passed. I mean, there's achievements for sure. I'm not saying that, I'm just saying the breadth of the agenda. That person's agenda is like 5 jobs right there. And so, again, there's this tendency to stick with people that you know and that you trust and just give them everything. So, good question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mary Miller, and I'm from Central Michigan University. And you kind of answered part of this question already, but is there an advantage to appointing acting directors or cabinet members rather than just going through the Senate confirmation process if he doesn't think that they're going to be confirmed?
I think that the advantage is to find people who are qualified for these jobs and to submit them to the nomination process. And like I said, if you have actings, it hampers your ability for long-term planning. It's really difficult for the people who work in those agencies if they think that you're acting. I think it's not a smart strategy at all. And in fact, President Trump recently, or in the past year, has said he likes actings because they give him the flexibility, but this was not a deliberate strategy. I think what happened over time is people started to leave, they couldn't find people to fill the jobs, so now they're stuck with putting people in as actings because they can't get them through the process. I think that the Senate should be concerned about this. Congress as an institution should care, because in a sense what they're doing is circumventing the Senate confirmation process by putting these individuals in. They don't have to be qualified, they just have to be sort of appointed by you to be actings. I'm somebody that cares deeply about the institutions of our government and the adherence to processes and to norms, and this is troublesome to me. I care a lot about the federal government, and I think that the frequency of actings may have also led to the departure of a lot of civil servants who have incredible expertise, have worked for various agencies and departments for 20, 30 years, and people are leaving. And I can understand the frustration. So I'm very opposed to kind of the frequency of actings. I think they need to find individuals who will take these jobs and find individuals that are qualified, that can get through the process. I understand the Senate confirmation process, if you've ever known anybody who's gone through it, it's incredibly time consuming. You have to turn over all of your financials, you go through an FBI background check, you go through a Senate committee background check. It's time consuming, it's taxing. So maybe there are people that want it, but we've never really had this problem in other administrations. Usually the opportunity to work for the President of the United States is something that people are willing to do backflips over and front handsprings and whatever they need to do in order to get those jobs. And I'm not seeing that this round. Thank you for your question.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
I'm Malin Vernetti from the University of San Diego. When I was reading last night your piece, I noticed something that struck me, which was unelected presidential cabinet, and I never really thought about that before. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, are there checks and balances for the presidential cabinet from the people's point of view or the governmental point of view? And if there aren't any, what would you suggest we maybe introduce in future legislation to implement checks and balances in the presidential cabinet?
Yeah, that's good. So I would just separate the cabinet from the White House staff, because the cabinet secretaries are indeed confirmed by the Senate and are accountable to Congress. They have to testify before Congress and things like that. But the White House staff, absolutely. If you also look at recent controversies with the presidencies, if you look at Watergate, if you look at the Iran-Contra affair, if you look at what's happened with this impeachment, it's staff that have been involved. They're the ones that are sort of turning the cranks of the government and moving the engines of government and stuff in ways that are sometimes illegal. So we need to care about staff. These people can do things that are unconstitutional, illegal, what have you. Unfortunately, I have no idea how you would go about regulating this. I think that if congressional oversight existed and was actually implemented and enhanced, the Congress could use the leverage of White House staff salaries over maybe kind of some of the misdeeds that some of the staff members have participated in over the years. But generally speaking, what's happened historically is, first it's important to point out that the emergence of the White House staff that we have now didn't really start till FDR. And then over time, the next big expansion in White House staff was with Nixon. But staffs before then were relatively small. And so I think a lot of it was under the radar. You never heard about speechwriters. You know how now occasionally you hear that, oh, so-and-so wrote this speech, or so-and-so takes credit for the Axis of Evil speech, or that never happened. All of these staffers were anonymous. So I think the problems and sort of the concerns that these staffers wield too much power is more of a recent phenomenon. And, Congress is the branch that has oversight over the executive. They're the only ones I can really think of that can constitutionally do anything to alter the state of affairs.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Melissa Ramajan from Central Michigan University. And I was just wondering if there are any known statistics for women working as high-ranking staffers and if there's any shift of change.
I'm happy you asked that question. I actually have a report that I'm working on now where we have a lot of demographic data on gender of senior White House staff members, whether they worked on the campaign. I first became interested in the career path. So what did people do before they entered the White House and what do they do after? And does the White House staff experience change their career path? But I can tell you that Ronald Reagan had the fewest amount of women, and the frequency of women on the White House staff has grown ever since. Obama had slightly more than Trump, but Trump's numbers are actually not that far off from his predecessors. So the trend looks good. Yeah. Okay.
Hi there. My name is Josh. I'm from Quinnipiac University. So I'm very...
Quinnipiac poll, right? That's a big deal. Gets a lot of attention.
I used to work at the Poll Institute, so I was the one making phone calls.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's how you do it. They're all poll. How many phone calls do you make to get one person to answer the question?
I would make maybe 150 and get maybe 3 to 4 responses, maybe.
That's what I've heard, is that the response rates are incredibly low.
Yeah, horrible. But I'm really interested in science policy. So under the Obama administration, the Office of Science and Technology Policy was around 130 employees, but the Trump administration actually gutted it to about 45.
Yeah.
I was wondering if in your research you've seen similar things between administrations, and if so, how has that impacted the policy coming out of offices that have been gutted?
So it's true, when a new president is elected, they basically have the capacity to structure the White House the way they want to. By and large, they keep a lot of the same positions. OSTP has been around for a long time, although I would say that Trump didn't appoint a director until I think the end of year 2 or maybe year 3 recently. Yeah. So it basically was without a leader for a long time. And each president comes in with a set of campaign promises and a set of priorities. And so that's how they structure and create their campaign staff. And so one example is President Bush, George W. Bush, created the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Because he believed that a lot of churches and organizations, faith-based organizations, could provide government services and do so and help the public at large. But when President when President Obama succeeded him, he changed the name of that office, and it became much less influential, I would say, in the overall realm of presidential offices. And so it's not unusual for presidents to prioritize some offices over others. Many times, like I said, it's in response to a campaign promise that they're trying to fulfill. With OSTP, I obviously think with science and what's happening with AI, what's happening in the cyber world, you can't ignore science. That's a really important policy area. But again, presidents do have to choose their priorities, and sometimes their staff is, the size of their staff is limited by the budget that they have. And I do think it absolutely can affect science policy. I think if I were somebody like you who was interested in that, I would probably try to put my weight and interest in advocacy groups that could lobby the president on behalf of science, and maybe talk to the domestic policy advisor or somebody in that realm that would have maybe some oversight over science policy. I think what you have to do as somebody who has some sort of outside interest that you care about and you want the executive branch to care about, even if an administration changes and it seems like something is less of a priority, you just have to be creative about how you're going to go about trying to influence them. Whether it's through your own Congress man or woman to try to go through congressional affairs and influence the president that way, or through domestic policy or something like that. You just have to kind of find another way through. The other thing that helps a lot is if there's something in the news about science policy. That will immediately catapult and draw the president's interest into the issue. And this is true for all presidents. Sometimes they don't care about an issue until it hits the headlines, and then they need to care. So that always helps as well. So
Thank you.
yeah, you all have great questions today, and I just want. Oh, do we have one more, or was that
One more.
one more quick one? Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Anthony DeFabio. I'm from Quinnipiac University, and I know you went over this in regards to past presidencies, their turnover rates, the consequences that follow, and Trump's turnover rates and the consequences that have followed were to be inefficiencies of running the government. But I was wondering if you could emphasize what may be the further consequences of high turnover rate presidencies.
Besides the inefficiency, I think that for a president, it's just hard to get your goals to implement your ideas and your goals because you don't have people that you can rely on. They don't become experts in their job. Remember how I told you when you enter the White House after inauguration, after all those great parties, you basically get there, you don't know what you're doing. Nobody does unless they worked in a prior administration. So the learning curve is, I can't even emphasize enough how steep the learning curve is. So once you've sort of figured it out, maybe 6 months in, then you can do your job somewhat, and then over time it gets better and better because you've created these relationships that are helping you advance the cause. But the frequency of turnover just makes it really difficult. You're just wasting so much time. And like, remember I talked about how you have 4 years. That's all you have. This is not a typical job where, you can work at, some sort of corporation for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. This is a 4-year time limit. And so I think turnover just sort of makes it more and more difficult for you to implement your ideas and your campaign promises.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thanks to you all. It was really a delight to speak to you and answer your questions. So thank you. I hope the rest of your 2 weeks goes well.